to real history. Could England really gather 35 tons of silver just to buy their king's freedom? The sun over the Levant in July 1191 was not a friend. It was a relentless, scorching eye that watched the blood soak into the sands of Acre, a strategic port on the jagged coast of modern-day Israel. For 2 agonizing years, this city had been the anvil upon which the Third Crusade was forged, a desperate holy mission to reclaim Jerusalem from the grip of the Saracens. Richard I, known to the world as the Lionheart, had arrived like a storm from the west, his fleet carving through the Mediterranean to save a dying cause. He had sailed thousands of miles from the cold mists of England to fulfill a vow, trading his emerald crown for a suit of interlocking steel mail. He was not merely a king, he was the de facto protector of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a warrior poet whose sword was as sharp as his legendary pride. And he had done the impossible. In the shimmering heat of the Battle of Arsuf, Richard had stared down the previously undefeated Sultan Saladin, shattering the myth of the Saracens' invincibility with a single thunderous cavalry charge that had sent shockwaves through the heart of Islam. To his soldiers, he was a living saint of war. To his enemies, he was a Malik, a king whose very name made the desert winds turn cold. Yet, as he stood upon the battlements of the conquered city, the air was thick with something more poisonous than the heat, the stench of a victory that tasted of copper and the dangerous, towering ego of kings. Beside the banners of England and France, Duke Leopold V of Austria had dared to raise his own standard. To Leopold, he was a fellow crusader who had bled for the cross. To Richard, the Duke was a mere scavenger, a minor lord unworthy of standing beside the Plantagenet lion. With a sneer that would haunt European politics for decades, Richard gave a curt signal. His men seized the Austrian banner, tore it from the stone, and cast it down into the filth of the dry moat below. The silence that followed was more dangerous than the roar of battle. Leopold, his face turning the color of bleached bone, did not shout. He did not protest. He simply watched his honor being trampled into the mud. In that moment, a seed of hatred was planted in the frozen soil of the Duke's heart, a seed that would wait through the changing seasons for its moment to bloom in the bitter cold of a distant winter. By October 1192, the crusade was over, but the Lionheart was a man without a path. The Mediterranean had become a labyrinth of enemies. The French king, Philip Augustus, had already fled home to plot, and the overland routes through Marseille were blocked by the vengeful Count of Toulouse. Richard was a lion caught in a closing net. He boarded a large galley, the Franche Naif, but the ocean itself seemed to side with his foes. In the northern Adriatic, the Bora, a fierce, freezing wind from the mountains, descended upon the waves with a predatory shriek. Lightning tore the night sky into jagged ribbons of violet, and the sea rose up like a wall of iron. Near the old Roman town of Aquileia, the ship was hammered against the shoals until its timber groaned and finally shattered. Richard emerged from the surf, drenched and shivering, but his spirit remained dangerously regal. He had only a handful of men left, including the loyal knight William de la Tongue. They were fugitives in a land of wolves. Richard, the master of drama, chose a desperate gamble. He would travel incognito. He stripped away his silk and mail, donning the rough brown wool of a merchant. He called himself Hugo. But a lion cannot easily pretend to be a sheep. As they moved through the territory of Meinhard II of Goetz, Richard's arrogance betrayed him. He tried to buy safe passage with a ruby ring so large it could have fed a village for a year. Meinhard, no fool, realized that Hugo the merchant carried the treasury of a kingdom in his pockets. The hunt was on. December 21st, 1192. a Monday draped in a suffocating leaden frost. Richard and his last two companions arrived in Erdberg, a small, unremarkable village on the outskirts of Vienna. The king was exhausted, his body racked by a fever he had carried since the Svata Zemlya, his reddish-gold hair matted with the grime of 19 days of flight. They took refuge in a lowly tavern, a place of sagging beams and the sour smell of stale ale. Richard, desperate for even an hour of sleep, sent his young German-speaking servant to the local market to buy food. It was a fatal mistake. The boy, perhaps swept up in the thrill of serving a king, behaved with a reckless flamboyance. He paid for a simple chicken with Byzantine gold bezants, coins so rare in Austria they might as well have been stars fallen from the sky. But the true death knell was tucked into the boy's belt. In a moment of sheer negligence, he was carrying a pair of Richard's royal gloves, magnificent, heavy leather embroidered with the golden threads of the Plantagenet crest. The market guards seized the boy. Under the persuasion of steel and pain, he whispered the truth. Back at the tavern, the door was kicked open with a violence that shook the dust from the rafters. Armed men swarmed into the dim light. Richard, hearing the clatter of mail, bolted into the kitchen. In a final, surreal attempt at disguise, the King of England grabbed a wooden spit and began to turn a row of roasting chickens over the fire, his face turned away, hoping the soot and grease would mask the features that had stared down Saladin. But the soldiers did not hesitate. A man who stands 196 centimeters tall and possesses the broad shoulders of a lifetime of knightly training does not look like a kitchen boy. "The spit is for commoners, my lord," a voice rang out. Richard stopped. He stood up, towering over the guards, the heat of the fire reflecting in his pale, light eyes. Even in his rags, the sheer gravity of his presence forced the soldiers to step back. He refused to surrender his sword to anyone but a peer. And so, into the greasy kitchen of an Erdberg inn, walked Duke Leopold V. The Duke smiled, a cold, thin expression of ultimate satisfaction. The banner of Acre had finally been avenged. The lion was in a cage. Richard was spirited away to the castle of Dürnstein, a fortress that did not merely sit upon the rock. It seemed to grow out of it like a jagged gray tooth. Perched high above the swirling gray waters of the Danube, the castle was a place where the wind sang through the battlements with a haunting, lonely whistle. He was held in the Bergfried, the massive central tower. His windows looked out over the golden vineyards of the Wachau Valley, but they were narrow slits that let in more cold than light. For months, the world did not know if the King of England was alive or dead. His brother, John Lackland, began to spread rumors of his demise, his ink-stained fingers already reaching for the crown. But Richard was not a man to be silenced by stone. In the quiet of his cell, the warrior found his voice as a poet. He composed his most famous song, Ja nus hons pris, No Man Who Is Imprisoned. "No man who is a prisoner can tell his story properly," he wrote, his voice echoing against the red sandstone walls. "But for his comfort, he can write a song. I have many friends, but their gifts are few. They leave me in these chains." It was a riddle wrapped in music, a cry for help that would soon travel further than any messenger. And then the legend whispers of Blondel. While historians debate the truth, the story remains immortal. The faithful minstrel Blondel de Nesle, traveling from castle to castle through the German lands, singing the first verse of a secret song he and Richard had written together. Under the walls of Dürnstein, he lifted his voice. From the high barred window, a second voice, strong, melodic, and unmistakably royal, responded with the second verse. The secret was out. The king was found. The Duke could not keep such a prize forever. In early 1193, Richard was sold, like a piece of fine livestock, to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI. If Leopold was driven by hate, Henry was driven by something far more calculated: greed. Richard was moved to the fortress of Trifles, a castle so secure it was used to house the imperial regalia. Here, the conditions turned brutal. On the orders of the Bishop of Beauvais, Richard's personal enemy, the king was kept in chains so heavy that he later remarked a horse would have struggled to carry them. The emperor set a price that made Europe gasp: 150,000 marks of silver. It was a sum beyond imagination, nearly 100,000 pounds of pure silver, or approximately 35 tons of the precious metal. It was more than 3 times the annual revenue of the entire English crown. Henry VI was not just asking for a ransom, he was asking for the literal wealth of a nation. In London, the news hit like a physical blow, but while Richard's brother John plotted with the French king to keep Richard imprisoned forever, offering the emperor 80,000 marks just to hold him 1 more year, another player entered the board: Eleanor of Aquitaine. The Queen Mother, now over 70 years old, was a woman of iron and fire. She did not weep. She acted. She assumed the regency of England with a terrifying energy. She wrote to Pope Celestine III, her letters dripping with a mother's fury and a diplomat's skill. "I am wasted away by sorrow," she wrote to the pontiff. "My bone clings to my consumed flesh. King Richard is held in chains. Restore my son to me, O man of God, if you are indeed a man of God and not a man of blood." She did not wait for the Pope's prayers. She turned England into a giant silver mining operation. She imposed the Lion's tax. Every citizen had to surrender a quarter of their income. But silver was not enough. She ordered the very heart of the church to be stripped. For months, the sound of hammers rang through the cathedrals of England as golden reliquaries were pried apart and silver crosses were melted into faceless ingots. In many monasteries, only wooden cups remained for the Mass. Everything of value had been offered to buy back the lion. The transport of the ransom was a feat of logistics that bordered on the miraculous. 35 tons of silver, packed into heavy wooden chests, guarded by a small army, had to be moved across the treacherous English Channel and through the predatory lands of the German Empire. Eleanor moved the money under the protocol of King's Peril. This meant that if the silver was lost to pirates or storms, the debt remained. The responsibility sat squarely on the shoulders of the English. Eleanor herself, despite her age, accompanied the final shipment to Mainz. She was a hawk watching over her brood, her eyes never leaving the chests that held her son's life. On February 4th, 1194, in the city of Mainz, the deal was struck. The emperor, having squeezed every possible ounce of silver and every shred of political concession from the king, finally ordered the chains to be struck off. As Richard walked out of the fortress, a free man for the first time in 14 months, the French king, Philip Augustus, sent a desperate 3-word message to Richard's brother John. "Look to yourself. The devil is loose." The devil did not waste time. Richard returned to England in March, landing at Sandwich to a nation that was penniless but delirious with joy. He was crowned a second time at Winchester, a ceremony of profound symbolism designed to wash away the stain of his imprisonment and reaffirm that the Lionheart bowed to no one but God. While Richard returned to his wars in France, the ransom he left behind began to transform the face of Europe. The 35 tons of silver did not simply vanish, they became the literal foundation of modern Austria. Duke Leopold V, despite being excommunicated by the Pope for his crime against a crusader, used his share of the silver with visionary coldness. He used the lion silver to build the massive stone walls of Vienna, walls that would protect the city for 700 years. He founded the city of Wiener Neustadt as a frontier fortress. Most importantly, in 1194, he used the silver to establish the Vienna Mint, striking new, stable coins that would make the Babenbergs one of the wealthiest dynasties in the world. Every stone in the old heart of Vienna, every ancient coin found in the Austrian soil, carries a microscopic echo of the king who was captured in a kitchen. Leopold, however, did not live to enjoy his stolen wealth for long. Just months after Richard's release, the Duke suffered a fall from his horse. His foot was crushed and gangrene, the black rot, began to eat his leg. On his deathbed, gripped by a sudden holy terror of the hell that awaited an excommunicated man, he ordered Richard's hostages to be freed and the remaining ransom money to be returned. He died in agony, a reminder that even the most powerful lords are but dust before the scales of fate. Richard the Lionheart's reign was a whirlwind that lasted only 10 years, of which he spent a mere 6 months in England. He was a king of the battlefield, a man who felt more at home in a hauberk than a robe of state. His end, fittingly, was as dramatic as his life. In 1199, he was besieging the minor castle of Chalus-Chabrol in France. He was not there for glory, but for more silver, a rumored hoard of Roman gold found by a peasant. One evening, walking the lines without his armor, he spotted a lone defender on the battlements using a frying pan as a shield and firing a crossbow with grim persistence. Richard, amused by the man's defiance, stood his ground. The bolt struck him in the left shoulder near the neck. The wound was not deep, but in the damp heat of the French spring, it turned malevolent. Sepsis, the blood poison, crept through his veins like a dark shadow. As he lay dying in his tent, he summoned the crossbowman who had struck him. The man was a mere boy. "What have I done to you that you should kill me?" Richard asked, his voice a rasping whisper. "You killed my father and my 2 brothers," the boy replied, standing tall before the dying giant. "I am content to die now that I have rid the world of you." In a final act of chivalry that mirrored the complexity of his character, Richard smiled. "I forgive you my death," he said. He ordered the boy to be set free and given 100 shillings. On April 6, 1199, Richard the Lionheart died in the arms of his mother, Eleanor. His body was buried at the feet of his father in Fontevraud Abbey. His entrails were interred at Chalus, and his great stubborn heart was taken to Rouen, where it was buried in the cathedral. Modern science has since analyzed that heart. In 2012, forensic teams examined the remains of the lion's heart and found traces of daisy, myrtle, and mint, the sweet-smelling herbs used to preserve it. But they also found the truth of the man, a heart that had been driven by an inexhaustible, burning energy. Richard was a king who Ojebrachil impoverished his country to save his own life, a man whose pride nearly destroyed his empire, and yet he remains the eternal symbol of the English spirit. He was a lion in a world of wolves, a poet in a world of iron, and a legend who proved that even when a king is in chains, his voice can still shake the foundations of the world. If you enjoyed today's return to the Middle Ages, I'd be truly grateful for your like. It's the best way to let me know that these stories are worth making. I'm already preparing the next chapter for you, so if you don't want to miss it, consider subscribing. I'll see you next week.